Annihilation. That's the formula for defeating all of our enemies. Yeah. Okay. Good evening. Good evening to our audience who's here in person and those who are streaming this evening's presentation. My name is Ruthie Gilmore. I'm the director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. And I'm delighted to welcome everybody tonight to our conversation. I want to thank, as ever, Mary Taylor and Michelle Cannon for organizing us into this space, and the tech people for setting us up so that we can beam out into the world. The title of this evening's presentation, as you know, is Capitalist Transformation, Hindu Nationalism, and the Politics of Citizenship in India. Capitalist Transformation, Hindu Nationalism, and the Politics of Citizenship in India. The presenters are Alf Nilsen and Mythri Prasad, my dear, dear friends and colleagues. Alf Nilsen is professor of sociology and director of the Center for Asian Studies in Africa at the University of Pretoria. His current research focuses on the politics of authoritarian populism in India and the Global South more generally. He is the author most recently of Adivasis and the State in India, Subalternity and Citizenship in India's Heartland, which was published in 2018, and he's co-editor of Indian Democracy, Origins, Trajectories, Contestations from 2019. Alf is really prolific, so if you go online, you can find all of his books, and you should read them. Mythri Prasad-Aleyamma is a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. And her research focuses on the politics of labor migration and urban transformation in contemporary India. It traces the different types of recruitment of migrant and local labor in Kerala that reflect political contests and settlements between trade unions, corporate construction companies, and recruitment agencies. She's published articles in Antipode, Contemporary South Asia, and Economic and Political Weekly. So our evening is going to proceed in the form of a conversation between Alf and Mythri will pose questions to Alf, and we'll let them get started. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Ruthie, for that wonderful introduction. This is in continuation of events we have been organizing at the center. It started in 2020 when we organized conversations about the Citizenship Act and the protests against the Citizenship Act that was going on in India in solidarity with it. And those were spread over the 3 months that those protests were going on in early 2020. And there was a, that was specifically focused on Hindutva fascism and its contemporary forms and how that relates to the history of oppression in India. So this would actually be, an event that's connected to all that we organized at the CPCP in early 2020. And today, we are going to be in conversation with Professor Alf Nilsen. And I think, Alf's work has now moved on to Hindutva. His early work is on mobilizations by Adivasis in Madhya Pradesh in the context of the anti-dam movement against the Sardar Sarovar project. So his early work is on mobilizations by Adivasis and their negotiations with the state. And it is ethnographic, and the insights that follow are very regionally specific, although with extreme theoretical implications for how we organize ourselves, how oppressed groups in India organize themselves, and what is their relationship to the state. So, but right now his latest work is on Hindutva. So my question is, how do you make this move? So from, it's a scale question, obviously, because we are, in a geography, amongst geographers, so welcome to that. But more than a scale question, it is also relevant in terms of how India, in quotes, historically has been an outward projection, right? It is hardly an inward projection. It's an outward projection both by, outsiders, so to speak, and how others saw the subcontinent, and rather than how many in the peripheries within India feel about India. So, and when you start talking about India, there is a trap that's set for you automatically to fall into this outward projection. So how do you see yourself and your scholarly trajectory?
Right. So let me have the mic here. Well, first of all, just thanks for having me back at the center. This is my intellectual happy place, as I refer to it, and I can't really even begin to, say how good it is to be back, especially after the, traumatic years that we've been through. So thanks for having me. Look, in terms of, making a shift to basically studying up in the Indian context, there is a rhyme and a reason to it. When I started working, doing research on social movements in India, it was the early 2000s. There was still a massive popular mobilization against dispossession going on in the Narmada Valley, which is in central India, where indigenous communities were losing their land to the construction of multiple dams. And that was, in a sense, India's Chiapas. That's its significance in terms of how it defined struggles over land in the country at that point in time. It just so happens that that particular region is located in central/western India, and the biggest dam on the Narmada Valley project is located across the boundary in the western Indian state of Gujarat. Now, as I was starting my research, things were also happening in Gujarat. That is, there was a massive anti-Muslim pogrom that took place that left as many as 2,000 Indian Muslims dead, and that pogrom occurred under the chief ministership of Narendra Modi and the right-wing Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party. Now, over the 10, 15 years that followed, whenever I went back to this region and, went out into sort of rural areas to study Adivasi movements, what happened in Gujarat was always there in the shadow. And it always resonated. There was always an echo of it in local politics. I'll give you an example. 2003, in the neighboring state of Madhya Pradesh, there were, on the lead up to Republic Day in January, you'd hear, men chanting Hindu nationalist slogans in the streets. You'd hear talk about the necessity of repeating Gujarat, having another Gujarat in Madhya Pradesh. When you went into rural areas, you would see how the Hindu nationalist movement, which is obviously not just the BJP as a political party, but a much wider ecosystem of movements working to penetrate into indigenous communities, redefining community subjectivities as Hindus and so on and so forth. So it was always there in the background. It was always there as a kind of spectral presence. And then you fast forward to the past 8 years and it's no longer in the shadows. Instead, what you have is a regime, a Hindu nationalist regime, that has entrenched itself at the center of political power in India, redefining the political landscape in a way that is quite spectacular. Because as you know, Hindu nationalism starts out as a political project that's anchored in upper class groups and the middle classes in India's cities. And that's not a combination that wins you political power in a country where the majority of people are actually poor and lower caste. So what Modi has managed to do is to establish a durable hegemony by bringing into the ambit of that project plebeian groups, let's call it that, you know, popular classes, subaltern groups, who were not previously supporters of that political project. And that is a significant part of the glue that holds together, you know, the current political conjuncture in India. And, you know, to put it in perspective, I think it's really important that we start by acknowledging that Modi is not the Trump of the tropics. You know, I hate that formulation because it suggests that there's a northern original up there in terms of what authoritarian populism is, and that you have these guys, you know, in India, in Brazil and elsewhere who are mimicking that. And what that fails to perceive is that the Modi regime is far more entrenched and embedded than other comparable regimes in the global north have been. And that's, of course, part of, we'll talk more about it as we move along, but it's part of the fact that this is a movement that has been mobilizing in India for a century. Now, what that has thrown up for me, you know, as someone who's engaged with India for 20 years now, who's, you know, and that engagement is not just scholarly, it's about activism, it's also about, you know, your friendships and your personal life. For me, that has thrown up the absolute imperative of engaging in conjunctural analysis. You know, I'm a big fan of Stuart Hall, as you might have gathered from my reference to authoritarian populism, and I think this is the moment when we really try and apply ourselves to understanding what authoritarian populism is in the Indian context and the global south more generally, and why it's so durable as a hegemonic force. That's the long and the short of the trajectory from social movements to studying the people in power currently.
That's quite, you know, well put. So you just mentioned that Hindutva is a movement, and I think you have an article that, you know, says the same thing, that Hindutva is, it's not a mandate, an electoral mandate, just not an electoral mandate, but also it's a movement. It's a movement for hegemony that was 100 years in the making. And in its most idealistic form, it's a desire for a Brahminic utopia that wants to annihilate Muslims, Christians, and communists. You know, that's what there's this book by Golwalkar called Bunch of Thoughts. It specifically says that. But in its concrete form, it's it's a messy, you know, multi-caste, multi-class coalition, as you just said, that is constantly looking to make inroads into politics, how politics, you know, happens, and what are the terms under which you can do politics, and also everyday life in terms of practices, not just religious practices, but also, you know, how you organize life itself. It is a movement that thrives on appropriation. You cannot make inroads into politics without appropriating already existing forms of life. So it's also appropriating and wants to reconstitute society and state in its terms. And in its avatar as the state, you know, Hindu Rashtra, it is interested in creating and consolidating a nationalist fervor that is violent and genocidal, and which also you just mentioned. So my question is actually, do you want to elaborate on this aspect of it as being movement, and how that relates to us when, you know, to our movements?
So I generally operate with this distinction between what I call social movements from above and social movements from below. And that's a way of trying to articulate a very simple point, which is that what you can broadly refer to as elite groups do not rule just by default. You know, it doesn't happen just like that. It takes work, right? It takes an awful lot of work, specifically in the context of representative democracy, such as India, where your ability to rule actually depends on garnering popular consent for a certain way of ruling. Now, when I say that, you know, Hindu nationalism is a movement and not just a mandate, I mean that it is a movement from above, of a very specific kind. It starts out, as I said, in the 1920s as a movement grounded in upper caste milieus in Western India, right? Urban upper castes who were profoundly disturbed by the emergence, and this is too often written out of our narratives about this movement, who were profoundly disturbed by Dalit and lower caste activism. This is the same time as you're witnessing, you know, in Western India, the emergence of strong anti-Brahminical movements, movements challenging caste discrimination, movements pointing out that the idea that there is in fact a common Hinduness is an ideological ploy to seek justification and legitimacy for caste-based oppression and exploitation. And we forget about that sometimes, I think partly due to the sort of the rampant Islamophobia that is so defining of Hindu nationalism. What Hindu nationalism is then is in part an elite response to, you know, very early forms of subaltern politics in India. A subaltern politics that challenged, if you will, one of the defining oppressive structures of Indian society. And there, from that starting point, and this is what's so important to remind ourselves of, the Hindu nationalist movement has burrowed its way through Indian civil society, you know, and that's for me, the sort of the defining criteria. That's what the thing that sets it apart from so many other social movements from above. They work their way through Indian civil society, developing an incredibly intricate network, infrastructure of organizations, right, around specific demographic groups. Students, farmers, workers, they have their own trade unions, women, indigenous groups, Dalit groups, all the rest of it. You know, they have their own special groups, so are their stormtroopers, they have their own special groups working on global scales around Hindu nationalist politics. And what this does is that, you know, over that long period, is that I think its success lies in defining a common sense, you know, in building to shape a common sense perception of what India is and should be. And of course, their central ideological motif there is the Hindu nation, which means that Hindu nationalism is a distinctive form of ethnic nationalism, where the majority community is defined as the nation. You know, the Indian nation state becomes the Hindu people nation. And the foil of that is the Muslim other, above all else. What the Modi regime represents for me is a decisive advance. The BJP has been in power centrally in India before, from 1999 to 2004, but that thing unraveled. It unraveled, I think, in part because they gambled on the idea of India shining. This was, you know, the promise of neoliberal reforms bringing about social mobility and prosperity to common people. Now that never happened, and the project unraveled. I mean, much to many of our surprise, you know, in 2004. We didn't see it coming. When the party returns in 2009, it's an altogether more powerful force that makes that vital leap from being a powerful force in civil society to actually controlling, in Gramscian terms, political society, by which I mean the formal apparatus of the state. And the foundation they're building upon is very strong. You know, it's a politics that resonates with an ideological common sense that has been cultivated over a very long time. That is also sustained by this tremendous infrastructure of movements that operate, that constantly crisscrosses the divide between civil and political society. And I think the durability of its current hegemony lies there. Its ability to attract the consent that it needs from popular classes, and we can see this on, you know, just looking at simple electoral statistics. The way in which support from lower caste groups and India's working poor has, you know, shifted towards the BJP is quite dramatic. So that the party today after certainly the 2019 elections, rules on the basis of commanding 44% of India's Hindu vote. That's substantial, and that's an embodiment of the idea of Hindu nationalism, right? That there is a united Hindu community that should stand together across lines of caste and class. You know, those lines and those fault lines that typically perforate and sort of, you know, pulls the Indian electorate apart in different directions. So that's a very significant political achievement. And I think that is, you know, the defining, one of the really important defining characteristics of this movement from above.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you know, I want to move on to another topic, which is, you know, in the title, we say it's about capitalist transformation too. So the straightforward question to ask will be, you know, how is all of these processes related to the changes in the relations of production? Or if you don't want to go into relations of production, but how is it related to, you know, how certain economic reforms have been carried out, and how is it related to the question of labor? And because we just said that, you know, working class people are voting for Modi, then why are they voting for Modi? Are they, you know, driven by a false consciousness? So how do we, you know, how do we make sense of that?
So, see, that is the question that I'm grappling with all the time. It's pretty much what I'm trying to cook up some kind of answer to. Let me give you my, I guess, 50 cents, or you know, it might even be $1 on that. So, first of all, I'm not going to talk about relations of production because, as Stuart Hall reminded us, that level of abstraction is not one you want to go to when you do conjunctural analysis. I want to start with something else. I want to start with, you know, a recent news story. I think it goes back maybe a month and a half, where Bloomberg, the media site, tells us that the second richest man in the world now is an Indian, an actual Indian living in India, who commands a fortune of $150 billion and who has basically kicked Jeff Bezos down to third place of Bloomberg's billionaire ranking. That man is Gautam Adani. He's a Gujarati business tycoon who's had long-standing ties to Narendra Modi. And he's the first Asian person to actually figure on that list of the robber barons of our times, right? Now, he's not just that. He's also first among equals in India's billionaire elite, which is a select group of 166 people who have seen their wealth absolutely skyrocket during Narendra Modi's rule. So, I mean, just if we just look at numbers, they're staggering. So, the 100 richest people in India, that is people earning more than $1.9 billion a year, hold a combined fortune of $800 billion, and they increased their wealth from 2021 to 2022. They've kept increasing their wealth throughout the entire pandemic period, so they've been extremely well insulated, in fact, compared to rich people elsewhere in the world. That's astounding. Now, this is being held up, right, by the current regime as testimony to the fact that Modi is doing what he said he would do when he first ran for Prime Minister in 2014, which was that he would bring development to the nation. He would bring development to the nation by relying on the magic of the marketplace. You know, he was going to take neoliberal economic policies that he had pushed through in Gujarat from 2002 to 2014 and apply them at a national level. And what that has resulted in, if we go by the language or the narrative, sorry, of the current dispensation, is that India is finally coming into its own on the world stage as a rising power. You know, finally coming out of history's waiting room and commanding respect in the world. That image, that narrative, is of course blatantly false. The existence of a Gautam Adani, the existence of a billionaire elite in India is symptomatic of everything that's wrong. with India's developmental trajectory over a long-term period and on steroids after Modi's election in 2014, because what this billionaire elite actually is a 10% upper crust of India's population that basically earns 57% of all income and controls 65% of all wealth, while the bottom 50%, 50 poorest percent of the population are relegated to earning 13% of all national income and owning 6% of all wealth. So what explains this? That's the key question. What explains that tremendous level of inequality? And the most immediate answer to it is economic policies. So neoliberalization in India has been relatively partial and piecemeal, as you well know. From the 1990s, when there was the balance of payments crisis, that meant that you couldn't stave off the pressure to liberalize anymore. Indian governments knew that they couldn't push this too hard because they would come up against opposition. From farmers, yes, from trade unions, yes, but also from their own business elites, who were not too keen on the opening up of the economy because they had done very well behind protectionist walls for a very long time. That has changed under Modi, most definitely. We have seen the liberalization of investment regimes, we have seen environmental regulations being thrown out the window, and very significantly, we have seen a substantial slashing of the corporate tax rate. I mean, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was something like 20% cut in the corporate tax rate in 2019. All of those are, of course, things that drive the capacity to accumulate, that drive super profits, and that explain some of the exponential development of wealth that we've seen among this billionaire elite. But I think it's more important that we ask what's happening beneath that in terms of social forces. Like, what are the social forces that are being realigned around these policies? And as you start to probe into that, there's a very clear pattern that emerges, which is that the concentration of economic power has come to correlate extremely closely with the correlation of political power, meaning that the power of capital and the power of the state are, locked together in an embrace that sustains both exponential inequality and the hegemonic resiliency of Modi's project. So what do I mean by that? I mean, first of all, that neoliberalization under Modi is defined by, capital being at the zenith of its power in the 75 years of India's existence as an independent republic. What we're seeing right now is an economy where private investment has become the driving force, outstripping the importance of public investment, which is an important change in the Indian context. And we see denser links between business and politics than we have seen before. And what that does is that it enables the small corporate elite to make super profits, and those super profits again sustain this sort of rent sharing, a very particular pattern of rent sharing, where there's a constant stream of payments going from India's corporate elite to the ruling party, in no small part through what's called electoral bonds, right? There's a way in which you can put money into party coffers anonymously, and we know that the majority of that goes to the BJP. None of this is meant to say that India is a case of capital paying the piper and calling the tune, because at the same time as you have this tremendous corporate consolidation and centralization happening, I mean, look, 65 to 70% of all corporate profit in India goes to the top 20 corporations in the country. That's saying quite something about the level of centralization and consolidation and concentration of wealth and concentration of corporate power. But it goes hand in hand with the centralization of political power. If we just look at what's happening internally in Modi's state, first of all, decision-making power and political power is concentrated in the Prime Minister's office, which reflects Modi's stature within the party. And we've also seen the party completely eliminate federal, collaboration between the central government and states in terms of economic policy. So again, a concentration of political power at the center. And what that means is that capitalism right now in India, capitalist accumulation is defined by the sort of pattern where you have profitable business actors and a very strong unitary central government working in tandem with each other, sustaining each other. Now you asked about labor, right? And the converse side of this, neoliberalization on steroids, what I referred to it in a recent article as rollover neoliberalism, following Jamie Peck, because this really is steamrolling neoliberalism. The worst side of that is the persistence of utter precarity among India's working class. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this figure, but let's look at it anyway. More than 90%, some say as many as 96% of all workers in India work in the informal sector. This is a long-standing feature, right, of Indian capitalism, but it's also one that hasn't been changed by neoliberal reform. There's been no formalization of the working class, and you have a working class that lives under the kind of conditions that Friedrich Engels would no doubt refer to as social murder, right? The kind of conditions where premature death literally becomes a defining feature of your precarity. A lot of this gravitates around low wages, and the fact that wage citizenship is utterly out of reach for the majority of India's working class, and that ties into the super profits again. So, in terms of capitalist transformation, for me, when you look at India's sort of capitalism in a long-term perspective, right now we're at a point where the power of capital is at its absolute peak. That's tied into the power of the state and the power of an authoritarian state also peaking. And the folks paying the price for this are basically India's working poor. But you still have this conundrum, which is that India's working poor lends their electoral support to this regime, right? That's the big question again, going back to where we started off. What is it about this? What is the? How does the BJP basically prevent this social crisis, this evident social crisis, from becoming a political crisis?
Right. Yeah, I want to actually, we should spend some time on this, because there is also, capitalist transformation also means transformation from a feudal economy, feudal land relations, so to speak, or caste-based occupations. So the post-1990s is also a time when migration to the metropolitan cities and small towns from rural areas by lower caste proletariat has accelerated. They escaped rural land relations that was feudal and steeped in caste-based servitude. So there's also a question of rural bondage that's being broken through this very process of capitalist transformation. In fact, my own work with this group that looked at subaltern urbanization in India, which means that, how do small cities make themselves in this context? How do, are they independent of are they growing independent of metropolitan cities? And what we found was that actually many of the small cities are not that tied in terms of capital or labor to the metropolitan cities, but are connected through entrepreneurial linkages with global capital or transnational remittance linkages and all of that. So there is a urban transformation that's happening, and coming to my own PhD project in Kerala in South India, it was about a port project, a port being constructed, how roads and railways are being built as connectivity to the port. So what you see is a subnational state, which is a left government, which is bringing in capital from, it was actually a port project being developed by Dubai Port World. So it also, was drawing on the connections Kerala has with the Middle East, bringing capital from there, destroying livelihoods, agrarian livelihoods, fish workers' livelihoods, changing coastal areas, destroying trade unionized local labor, but also, workers coming in from West Bengal and Bihar and Assam. Many are Muslim migrants. Many don't have documents. They find Kerala as a better place to, grow roots as temporary workers. So you see a movement of workers that's parallel to this capitalist. So how do we make sense of that mobility of workers, mobility of not just workers, but also, I mean, when we look at, when we just look at the top layer and the bottom layer, we miss the middle, right? The entrepreneurial energies of, for example, subaltern castes in India, especially in places like Kerala or Tamil Nadu, where this lower caste mobilization that you referred to in the pre-independent period had some success.
Sure.
So how do they respond to this capitalist transformation is totally different from how, where lower caste mobilization was crushed, for example, in Uttar Pradesh or Madhya Pradesh, how they are negotiating capital is different from, where there's some power that's held by a ruling class. So what I'm asking about is how are the regional ruling class negotiating this conjuncture? And how do we differentiate between different types of, these formations of power, and not just this inequality in a broad sense, but also as a layered process?
Well, I think it's important to I think one way into addressing that question would be to focus on the sort of broad dividing line, within sort of how Indian capital is constituted, between that, the billionaire elite that I referred to, the tycoons basically, whose accumulation strategies are national in scale, but also global, right? They are global players, and they accumulate at a scale that is therefore, very substantial. And that's reflected in their political influence and power. What you have beneath them are, regional forms of capital that tap into subnational markets, and whose profits are on a lesser scale, and whose political power are also on a lesser scale. Now, I'm often asked whether, there are conflicts between these two groups. It is evident that there's an objective potential for it. But what we do know is that the current regime enables the cannibalization, if you will, of those regional capitalist groups by the upper layer, of tycoons. We know this. We know that regional capitalists will basically offer up their corporations, their firms for sale when they're being told that it's time for you to do so by the current dispensation. And this enables, India's corporate upper crust to make its way into the sub-regional scale as well. So for me, it's more of a question of where that process is likely to take us, in terms of how it's likely to further intensify the consolidation of corporate power, of corporate power in India. That for me is going to be one to watch, because that is a space of expansion for the upper crust, and I think it's going to be crucial in terms of also futures for labor in India. Because imagine what a further consolidation of existing power equations would entail, especially when we know that the levels of organization among India's working class are on the decline, especially when we know that the associational power of India's working class has been eroding. There is the annual general strike that is often made much of, on social media and so on and so forth, but at the risk of sounding very cynical, it doesn't reflect, the actual striking power of India's working class, in no small part because of, informality, in no small part because there has been relatively little interest in organizing the informal working class, also from the left, right? So there is no corresponding counter-push, there is no counter-punch, there's not that countervailing force that one would hope for. So certainly a concern for me is that in terms of how different groups of capital relate to these transformations, a crucial concern for me is the very real prospect that the cannibalization that I referred to will be a strategy by which concentration and centralization of capital further increases, and what that entails in terms of capital-labor relations is a further, a deepening of the lopsidedness that we already see. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, that's, I think, what's called a radical pessimism. Yeah. So you think that all this, I mean that more than conflicts and contestations of capitals and Hindu nationalism's power, you see a scope for further consolidation and possibly, I mean, so to crush these, local power structures and harvest it for Hindutva. Yeah. It's not only a question. It's not only a question of economic power. It's also a question of crushing caste power, actually, because what is a Gujarati upper caste is not the same as Malayali upper caste, or Tamil upper caste, or Andhra upper caste. All of these are oppositional forces to this, Indian bourgeoisie that's emerging. So how do you? I mean, what is at the heart of that pessimism? Like in the sense that you seem to be suggesting that the question of economy is larger, that it has the capacity to overpower these very different formations. The I wouldn't call it cultural, but it's a local state society market conjuncture that's being regional local conjunctures that are being, or not conjuncture, what's the formations that are being crushed by this emerging Indian bourgeoisie.
Yeah. Look, the heart of the pessimism, I think, is sort of this really pressing need to recognize a durable hegemonic project when we see one, right? I think it's very important there's a sense in which you have to give, the devil his due. When dominant groups have labored long and hard to construct a hegemonic formation that has durability to it, there are two questions, that we have to relate to. First of all, how did they do it? What's their magic sauce, because it's only that can take us to credible answers to a second question, which is how does one unsettle those hegemonic alliances that give it strength? I don't think, someone asked me a question, I think, yesterday, like, is there a chance that, these regional groups that you're referring to, sort of, where sort of caste and capital come together to form the basis for local and regional forms of accumulation, is there a potential for them to become a source of discontent in relation to the current regime and challenge? I don't think so, because I think the power equations are so unequal. So I would rather, in a sense, expand out from your question and say, what is it about this project that's been operating now for close to 10 years in Indian politics that's able to sustain itself, even though it presides over overall national economic decline? I mean, this is very important to be aware of. India's economic growth has been stuck in deceleration long before the COVID pandemic hit, right? Unemployment was at a 45-year high before the pandemic hit. 60% of all people in India lived on less than $3.10 a day before the pandemic hit. And then we think of the fact that of the 71 million people who fell into poverty with the pandemic, 80% are Indians, right? So we think of all that. We think of demonetization, taking out some 85% of all currency out of the economy. An economy which is primarily cash-based, particularly in rural areas, which is where 65% of the population still, live and eke out a living. How do we explain that they still hold on to power? Why has the shelf life of this not expired? that for me is a crucial question, and this takes us back to Hindu nationalism. You know, why is this social crisis not coming back to haunt them? And when you look at it, there are two things I think we have to recognize. One is the fact that the Hindu nationalist movement and the BJP has been engaged in a process of social engineering since the early 1990s, when it became very clear to the leadership at the time that if we're going to become a force to be reckoned with in Indian politics, we actually need to win support among what we can broadly call popular classes. Thus begins a process, right, of reaching out to lower caste groups and to sort of or any sort of mid-level caste groups, especially in rural areas, and saying that we can do things here. We can offer you political representation through our party. We can broker access to welfare resources for you in exchange for political allegiance. And this is, of course, sort of populist patronage politics by the book, right? They've continued to do so, but they've done other things as well. And this sort of takes us to, if we reflect now for a minute on how that relates to capitalist transformation, it takes us to a question of how Hindu nationalism manages to tap into some very complicated structures of feeling that have emerged in the context of India's changing political economy. And I think this has relevance for the Global South more generally, right? So what's the defining feature of the Global South over the past, let's say, 20, 30 years? Is that the majority of countries in the Global South are actually middle-income countries, right? That's a major change in terms of the Global South in economic geography. But at the same time, it's those middle-income countries, many of whom are sort of recognized as being rising powers, that are home to the majority of the world's poor. So what am I getting at here? I'm getting at, a class structure that's crystallizing, where you have most people living above that morally repugnant poverty line that the World Bank has operated with for a very long time, of $1.90 a day. The minute you're on $1.91 a day, you're not poor anymore. Imagine that. And I usually do this exercise with my students in Pretoria all the time, that you make a list of the things you can buy in South Africa for $1.91 a day, at any given point in time. So not much. But, okay, so you have most people over that, but then you establish another line further up of $5, and the vast majority of people do not get over that. And I think what that creates, what those sort of objective economic condition creates, is a very precarious chunk of the population whose lives are defined by anxieties and aspirations at the same time. I think there are aspirations towards social mobility that are very strong. We know this from work that's been done on, say, the young working class, both male and female, and so on and so forth, in India's special economic zones, anticipating better futures, whilst the present just keeps churning along as utter precarity, and also deep anxiety about falling back into even more abysmal poverty. And I think the secret sauce, the success of Hindu nationalism lies in harnessing that. So let's talk about how they do that. I think they do that by fusing neoliberal ideology and Hindu nationalist ideology. How does that happen? Well, it happens, by projecting this image of India as a market-oriented country that's rising to global prominence, that's breaking the shackles of the colonial past, and so on and so forth, and constituting itself as a rising power. This is a capitalist dream world, where the investor citizen can become what the investor citizen wants to be. There's nothing holding you back if you just act prudently and invest wisely, and so on and so forth. So it's a capitalist dream world. But if you look at the BJP's messaging, India is also fundamentally remains, even as a dynamic market power, a Hindu civilization. That never changes. That essence doesn't change. So the nation that's rising is also a Hindu nation. To extend on that, what this means is that in a relation where you have these sort of anxieties and aspirations floating around, you have a political player that's making a double promise. One is a promise of development, right? That speaks to the aspiration for social mobility, that speaks to the anxieties about social decline, and that harnesses it and says that you can be included in this glorious national rise. Nothing can hold you back. That's the messaging. And most of the folks that that's being said to, precisely because there's such an overlap between, in terms of how, in terms of caste structures and inequality, precisely because the vast majority of the mega rich are upper caste. I mean, the numbers are staggering in terms of that overlap. The simultaneous promise that's being made is that of inclusion in that notion of common Hinduness that has been there at the core of Hindutva from the very start. Now, when I started to try to think about what we can call that, my sort of go-to idea is that of psychological wages. There is a sense of gratification, I think, here, that's being held out by Hindu nationalism. It requires some untethering of the concept, but I think it's good to untether our concepts sometimes and take them elsewhere and stretch them in other contexts. And I think what Hindu nationalism does, in addition to its very sort of strategic engineering, its patronage politics, which is populism 101, is that I think it extends a psychological wage to a very substantial chunk of the population whose lives are defined by the anxieties of precarity, the aspirations of precarity, and the added promise of dignity that has very often eluded those on the lower end of on the lower end of India's caste structures. And I think that